to another episode of The High Ground, powered by Premier Companies. And Ryan, in the podcast room with us today, we have our longtime participant in the podcast and our resident agronomist, Glenn Longabaugh.
Good to have you, Glenn.
Good morning, guys.
Glenn, there's a lot of reasons I think that people are talking about wheat and going into next year, and we're far enough south where we can double crop, and we might have to explain some of that. But what do you think about growers now that maybe haven't put out wheat in a while, and we have several of those, and then going into this 2022-23 crop year? What do you think about the buzz that's around wheat? I guess there's reasons why with the shape that the European breadbasket is in with the wars. So tell us a little bit about what you think about the wheat and the opportunities there, and some of the watch-outs, some of the, I guess there's things about wheat that we got to get right to begin with.
That's true.
So let's start there. What do you think about the double cropping and the wheat system?
Yeah, so we have a wonderful opportunity here, right? So I used to cover a lot more of the state of Indiana than what I do now, and there's an obvious line that goes across Indiana. If you're north of that zone, then double crops don't work. And if you look at the economics of wheat and then having the ground fallow following a wheat crop, the economics are terrible.
Yeah.
But here, where we oftentimes can raise, a 40, 45. I mean, we've had double crop bean yields, in excess of 50 bushel with some regularity. Then, wheat, double crop soybeans really is a very attractive offer, and it's a great rotation, right?
Sure.
It's a wonderful rotation, and you get some cash flow. I would just tell you that people that haven't been raising wheat are oftentimes the learning curve is pretty steep, right? Wheat is kind of a gentleman's crop. It requires a lot of husbandry if you want to raise really good wheat. That's not to say you can't have really good wheat and do it in a lackadaisical manner, but it probably is just anecdotal. It probably is accidental, is what I'm saying. Right? If you want to raise really good wheat with regularity, there are just some things that you have to do. And I often hear some of my peers. I mean, there are experts in the industry that talk a lot about wheat management, and yet I listen to them. I'm like, man, you are oversimplifying this. And in fact, growers listen to them and they go, oh, well, raise big wheat, all you have to do is just throw a bunch of stuff at it, right? It's just about spraying it a bunch of times, and that's not really true. Wheat requires a lot of husbandry on the front end. It really does.
And one of the things is making the plan for next year. I mean, for the next summer, for June, what you're going to do when it comes off. But I guess before you put the wheat in the ground, what's some of the things you need to decide before you plant the wheat?
Yeah, that's a wonderful segue. Thank you, Sal. Here's what I tell you: if first of all, if you think you're going to raise wheat in 2022 into 2023, you probably need to find out what the availability of wheat seed is, because there's so much interest that wheat seed is going to be crazy tight this next year. But beyond that, let's say you've already obligated, hey, I am missing out on wheat, I'm going to start raising wheat. There are some fundamentals that you need to know. And here's the primary thing. When I think about wheat agronomics, I used to work with Chris, which sometimes consults you folks, Ronan Cummins, these guys, I worked with them, 30 years ago. And when they first came in, Philip Needham was actually stationed at my plant, whenever I was in ag retail. And these guys were excellent agronomists that really set the stage for us to increase wheat yields substantially. Anyway, now that I've struggled through that, let me tell you what I think it takes to raise really good wheat. You need to start by knowing what good-looking wheat looks like. You need to know what the target is before you just start shooting, right? You can't just shoot and say, oh, look, I did hit the target over here after the fact. And here's what we learned from these fellows years ago, that there is an optimum number of heads per acre. And you can divide that down, because that's like millions of heads. That's like 3 million heads per acre, right? So let's break it down into square feet or square yards. And I typically think in square yards on wheat. We know that the optimum number of heads per square yard is somewhere between 6 and 900, right? Typically, if you can get 6 to 900 heads per square yard, then you probably had the optimum number of heads. You were in that ideal window to get top yields. Now, knowing that, you need to know that wheat isn't a one-to-one relationship, right? It's not like we sow 36,000 plants on corn and we end up with 33 to 34. On wheat has this ability to tiller and make clones, make suckers of itself. And so there is a kind of you need to understand. So when you order your seed, you need to know whether this is a variety that tillers a lot or it's one that maybe resists tillering. And so ideally, some of the best wheat is where you have that optimum number of heads and you have an optimum number of tillers, right? So if the optimum number of tillers is 2 to 3 per plant and the optimum number of heads is 6 to 900, then we can do the math to say, hey, we probably should start out with somewhere around 300 seeds per square yard. And if we want to account for some mortality, we could make it maybe 3 1/4, right? But then it's about managing the wheat to get that optimum number of tillers, right? And typically you manage wheat tillering with 2 things, planting date and nitrogen, right? So the earlier you plant, typically the more robust the plant is about tillering, right? And so if we plant 300 seeds and we get 2 tillers per plant, that's including the main culm, you're going to end up at 600 heads per square yard. If you plant 3 1/4 and you end up with 2 1/2 tillers, you're going to probably be at 750 to 800 heads per square yard. There's a real important reason. Maybe I overlooked this, and maybe we should start there. The reason why you don't just go willy-nilly at seeding is because 60% of your yield typically comes off of the main culm, not off of the tillers. And the reason why you don't just sow 6 to 900 seeds is because typically wheat will tiller some. And so the real sweet spot is to plant the right number of seeds and then use either planting date or in-season intelligence to use nitrogen to manipulate that wheat to keep or put on the right number of tillers.
But the nitrogen, does that need to be put down foundationally before it needs to go pretty early, right?
Yeah, so here's the deal. You probably have enough most times in just your DAP, right? If you made a DAP application that's probably enough to get you started. And if we're planting really early, let's say, we have a certain number of growers that always want to go ahead of the fly free date, they're going to get more tillering. And so they probably need to keep enough nitrogen on that crop to keep it healthy and green, but they don't want to put so much nitrogen on that it actually induces it to tiller more. They probably want to withhold nitrogen as long as they can. If we're talking about in that October 15th time frame, yeah, you could probably have a little nitrogen on it up front. The plant's probably not going to get too robust in the fall, and then you just want to delay nitrogen in the spring to, still probably 2 passes, but it's about delaying it until you are sure you have the right number of tillers. It's really about reconnaissance, right? If you have 1 tiller per plant, then you probably need to put more nitrogen on early. If you have 3 tillers per plant, you need to withhold nitrogen as long as you can to keep it from making too many tillers.
Yeah, because the other thing is, okay, I want lots of wheat. I want 900. I'm going to go ahead and plant, 700 just in case I don't have. But if you get too many tillers, what happens?
Well, remember, most of your yield comes off of the main culm, but if you overpopulate it, they all will be reduced in yield, right? Mm-hmm. And so again, there's this optimum number of heads, optimum number of tillers per plant, and there's optimum seeding rate. And this is the part that gets overlooked, right? Everybody knows that, hey, we got to kill the weeds, and everybody knows we have to kill the pathogens, and everybody knows we have to feed this crop, and we need to do it multiple times, and that typically we get more yield by making applications later in the year, because then it doesn't stimulate more culm length and more plant. It's then really influencing yield, right? But but they overlook the precursors, right? It's like trying to raise 100 bushel soybeans with 180,000 plants. You plant 180,000 soybean plants, I can't help you raise 100 bushel beans because we don't have the prerequisites, right? And that's why I wanted to cover that today. Is now is a great time to think about these prerequisites, right? It's about let's order seed and let's get intelligence on whether it is a variety that tillers a lot or whether it's a variety that doesn't tiller a lot. And then let's decide what our seeding rate is going to be. Oh, by the way, you probably ought to go calibrate the drill, right? Because if you think you can just go out there and set a drill and it's going to put on what the book says, you're crazy. It doesn't work that way. And so that piece of equipment probably needs to be calibrated. And if you get wheat off to a really good start, it's going to make your life so much easier the rest of the year.
So 2 things. But I don't want to let you skip over the fly-free date. You might. I think we need to just anticipate that some people have no idea what we're talking about on that. So fly-free date has nothing to do with Southwest Airlines.
No.
And also, before we get ahead, you said you might want to calibrate the drill. I can remember at times past people who wanted to jump in and out of the wheat business didn't necessarily have a drill because they use their planters for their beans, so they don't necessarily have a drill laying around. Quickly hit on the fly-free date, and also if you're left with a 15-inch planter, is there anything you can do with wheat in 15-inch rows?
Yeah, so let's start with the fly-free date, and I feel a little self-conscious here. I'm like Betsy. Betsy made the comment the other day. She's up at Ceres that she's never seen a Hessian fly, right? And I would say that I can't remember the last time I saw a Hessian fly.
Then how do we have that beat into our heads?
Well,
October 5th. It's like marked on the calendar.
Yeah,
fly-free date. I don't know if that's the right date. I think it floats. But.
Well, it depends on what your latitude is, right? So the farther south you go, then the fly-free date is later, right? For my neighborhood, it's October 8th. It's actually my birthday. If you go farther north, then the fly-free date gets earlied up. But it's really around an insect pest that lays an egg on the plant and it hatches, and typically the larvae will cause problems later in the year, and typically it kind of saws it off. I don't know that we have a tremendous amount of problems with Hessian fly, but it turns out that if you get out there much before the fly-free date, what you end up doing is causing a boatload of tillering, and oftentimes you end up with this great big robust plant that ends up getting frost damage in the spring anyway.
Hammered in the spring.
So I don't know the fly-free date is so much about Hessian fly in my mind as it is about
a brake pump.
Yeah, it's about pumping the brakes and keeping you from having too robust a plant. So I'm so glad that you guys brought that up, and I can show my own insecurity around an insect pest, right? But here's what I tell you about 15-inch rows, right? 15-inch rows, interestingly enough, they yield. By the way, they don't yield with 7s or 10s, but they do yield surprisingly well. But there's some things that you need to know, right? You would think that in 15-inch rows, we probably need to pull the seeding rate back, and we need to pick something that really tillers well, right? That would be my first intuition. And I remember back when I was with Syngenta, right? I was with Syngenta a lot of years, and used to talk a lot about wheat management, and we had wheat varieties then that were really good at tillering. We had some varieties that didn't tiller a lot. And your first instinct, right, when you go to wide rows, just like if you're raising wide rows over in Premier's Western Territory, right? There's a lot of guys that still have 36 and 38-inch rows when you get into the Amish communities, and yet they still raise great crops, right? They're not raising 300 bushel of corn, but they still can raise awfully good crops. Well, wheat is very similar to that. You would think that in 15-inch rows, you'd want a variety that tillers a lot, and that you'd probably pull the seeding rate back. That's not really the way it works out.
I had a feeling you was going to tell us that.
Yeah, the data would suggest that it's a lot like 38-inch row corn. It's actually fixed-eared hybrids in 38-inch corn, and then it's products typically that can handle crowding are the ones that typically do well in those crazy wide rows. It's the same in wheat. Turns out that those varieties that don't tiller well are the ones that typically handle 15-inch rows better. And then they can also handle that increased seeding rate. You're not increasing the seeding rate, but to the plant, the the net is that it feels that it's being crowded, because even at the same seeding rate, they're much closer together. So you're still pulling the seeding rate back a little bit, but the plants have the environment they're in is one of high seed environment, right? So I don't really want to talk about brands because I'm not that current on the latest varieties, and probably should get brushed up before this fall. But I do know that some of the legacy varieties that didn't tiller well did really well in 15-inch rows, and it was totally counterintuitive to what I expected back whenever I used to manage a lot of wheat.
Well, one thing we haven't seen is Hessian flies. That must have been like an event back in the 1960s, and then that got ingrained in agriculture. But one thing we have seen is aphids, and that's a vector for barley yellow dwarf.
Yep.
What about treated wheat seed?
Yeah. So that's a great segue, and I'm glad you went there. There is an easy remedy for bird cherry aphids, and that is using thiamethoxam on the tree, on the seed treatment, right? Whether it's, it really doesn't matter since it's a monocot, whether it's thiamethoxam or whether it's imidacloprid, right? Either one of those will give you acceptable control early on bird cherry aphids. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't probably scout after the first of the year or sometime later in the winter, but we know that where you use these neonic seed treatments that are systemic in nature, you have a much lower incidence of barley yellow dwarf mosaic virus, and it's because you controlled the bird cherry aphids early on.
Good.
Sorry, I kind of got caught up there because the deal is we handle several brands, right? The Warden cereals that some have thiamethoxam, some have imidacloprid.
Yep.
But I would, if it was me, I would use a broad spectrum fungal product. Right, something like a Warden cereals too, and then probably you will add something like Resonate to that, which is imidacloprid at this latitude. The other thing I would consider, especially if it gets into later planting, I would consider putting Ascend on wheat. Right, if it's early, I probably wouldn't put Ascend on wheat because I don't really want to encourage any more tillering and any more vegetative growth. But especially when we get into later planted. One of the things that Premier can do is they can use the water soluble granular, which is a water based version or formulation of Ascend, and actually use that as a seed treatment. And it makes a profound impact on early season vigor on wheat.
Good. So we got our population right. We got our tillers right. It's Christmas. There's maybe snow. So now what?
Yeah, so, from here on out, it might be another high ground episode, right?
Yeah.
It's talking about managing through the year, but just so that just to take the 10,000 foot level, right? We want to scout sometime late fall, make sure we got all the bird cherry aphids, make sure we don't have a lot of weeds, right? There's a lot of winter annuals that actually limit wheat yields, and controlling them in the fall has a huge impact on yield versus controlling them in the spring, right? You can get the same level of control on a fall application and a spring application, make 10 bushels difference in the wheat.
Wow. Well, let's talk about the fall application, and then I think we probably will make another high ground episode out of in-season management of wheat. So, what do we need to do for weed control?
Yeah, so if we're thinking about fall applications, there's a lot of the same products, but if we're going to use growth regulators, we have to be really, really careful. You cannot go in and make pre-emerge applications of dicamba or 2,4-D, either one. Once it emerges, then there are windows in there where you can make dicamba applications. When it gets a little bigger, then you can make 2,4-D applications. If you look at the labeling, it is crazy confusing. Right? And so make sure before you make an application, go visit with your Premier account rep, and maybe it's time to think about maybe spending a little bit more and using maybe an SU, right? Using something like a Harmony.
Yep.
Any of those products will give you equal to, maybe even better than control, and there's much less likelihood that you're going to dink the crop, right? And so just to kind of bait the audience for the next high ground on wheat, which we probably should do maybe next winter. It's really what's how you manage from there on is really around nitrogen management, right? It's about getting enough on to make sure you have the right tillers, keep the plant healthy, but not so much to encourage too much tillering. And then we get into the spring, it's about monitoring plant nutrition, right? We're going to make sure we have enough. Typically, we get short on sulfur. If we didn't make a sulfur amendment in the fall, typically we'll get short on manganese. We'll get short on copper. There are several nutrients that can be limiting to wheat. But if you start out right, wheat is very easy to manage on the tail end, right? It's a couple of fungicide applications and some, maybe another insecticide application, but it's really and one growth regulator, right? We like to use Palisade so that we can increase the nitrogen rate higher and not have lodging, right?
Yeah.
And by the way, that when we like to put on the majority of our nitrogen is after it started joining. Once it gets past that Feeks 5, Feeks 6, which is where it's a little small rosette, and it starts to joint, then we can put on nitrogen without it actually impacting the number of tillers, right?
All right.
And so if we get the right number of plants and then we feed it well, we get into late spring, we can then jack it up with nitrogen. We use Palisade to keep it shorter, right? It doesn't decrease the number of cells, but what it does do is it makes it's a gibberellic acid blocker, right? It actually inhibits the production of gibberellic acid, so the cells are still the same number of cells, but the cells are not as elongated and the cell walls are thicker and they don't tend to break as easy, right? And so these are all strategies along with fungicides to make sure that we not only have really healthy wheat that yields well, but also is sellable, right? If we don't control head scab, then you probably have a bunch of wheat that you can't sell.
Bad quality.
Yeah, you have bad quality. So
I have one more question for this side of the winter.
yeah.
Bearded or unbearded wheat?
Yeah. I have.
There was a lot more discussion on that, what I was selling, than I ever thought there probably should be.
Yeah. I'll tell you personally, I want the highest yielding wheat regardless of whether it has an on it. But I would also tell you this, that personally, the awns just absolutely tear me up. There's something about it. I couldn't get into poison ivy and be any.
It always came down to how a guy was going to handle that. If he was combining it, he maybe didn't care. If he was chopping it, he did care.
Absolutely.
It was crazy. I mean, it was crazy. It was the handling of it.
Absolutely. I mean, if you ever see you can always tell whether they've had an on variety or not. You go out and look at their Draper header, and you see the fuzz coming out of every small crack or every small break in the sheet metal is full of these beards that are on there. But yeah, they, especially like on barley. I use barley as a cover crop. I get some from Larry about every year. And I'm telling you, it absolutely tears me up. I scratch like a dog with fleas and break out in a rash and everything else. And so there's something about, I think if you could look at it microscopically, it probably has little hooks on it, or there's something about the structure of those awns. But
I just thought I'd ask because it's really mainly just the people's reaction to it versus what it has to do with yield.
Yeah, well, it's just like pubescence in soybeans, right? It's probably. It's anecdotal. It's there's some people that love red beans, and they'll talk about beans that have a red or
ugliest field of gray beans I've ever seen in my life.
Absolutely.
They could yield 100 bushel the acre, but I hate them because they're gray.
Well, when Stein used to have a lot of gray beans, and they had a lot of yield potential. It's kind of a parent material company. And but they historically, the first ones had some terrible problems with lodging, and that that becomes a stigma in your mind. But I got to admit, there's nothing sexier than a bean that has a red pubescence and stands up and feeds into the combine well. I mean, there's no question that's really attractive. But I've probably raised better light tawnies and gray beans than I ever did red beans.
Only an agronomist that also farms would say that there's nothing sexier than a red red bean at harvest.
Yeah.
For sure. Well, thank you very much. There's a lot to wheat. I mean, we've had the jokes before about the cover crop stands that come up, and you think in the spring, I don't know whether I should burn that down or whether I should top dress it and move on with it. But there's a lot more to it. You're right. You might get lucky, but
Yeah.
but
Well,
it's a strategy.
Well, you think about it. We often talk about managing corn across the entire season with multiple meetings, right? But if it's wheat, then we give it a paragraph. It's a footnote to other crops.
Sure.
And yet it's a
Sure.
it's a wonderful crop, and it's a lot more. Everybody thinks that raising good wheat is just about what you put on it, and really, there's a lot more to the husbandry of wheat. There's more influence to yield on the husbandry than there is just throwing inputs at it. That's the takeaway.
Okay.
Back to the plan.
Very good.
All right. Well, that's another episode of The High Ground. Ryan, Glenn, thanks for joining us in here today. And all of our listeners, thank you very much.